Imagine being at the helm of the grandest ship ever built, a marvel of engineering, proclaimed unsinkable. Now, picture that same ship meeting its end in the freezing Atlantic, its fate sealed by an iceberg. This is a minute-by-minute account of the Titanic's final hours, seen through the eyes of Captain Edward J. Smith, the man who bore the immense weight of command on that tragic night. Dive into his thoughts, his decisions, and his struggles as he faced the unthinkable, the sinking of the Titanic. Captain Edward J. Smith was alone in his cabin, gazing at a chart of the North Atlantic routes and reflecting on how flawlessly Titanic had performed thus far. In his decades of seafaring, he had guided countless voyages across these same waters. Yet the immensity of the ocean never ceased to stir him. Tonight, he felt a quiet pride. This was the grandest ship afloat, and she was under his command. Then came a shudder so distinct it made his heart jolt. Titanic's steel hull quivered as if scraped by a giant claw. Smith was on his feet in an instant, adrenaline pumping through his veins. He stepped into the corridor. Even before a breathless crewman sprinted up to warn of a collision, the captain sensed something had gone terribly wrong. Within moments, he was on the bridge. The night was dark, with only the faint glow of stars to hint at the horizon. First Officer William Murdoch stood at the wheelhouse, tense as steel. He told Smith they had just collided with an iceberg along the starboard side. It was no glancing blow, though no one yet knew how severe the damage might be. Murdoch explained the helm orders he had given, an attempt to swing Titanic to port, then reverse the engines. An attempt that evidently had come too late. Smith's mind churned. Titanic was hailed as practically unsinkable, but no ship was invulnerable. His first thought was to confirm the state of the forward compartments. He sent a quick summons for the ship's carpenter, the chippy, a standard crewman on large liners, to assess the hull. Next, he sent for Thomas Andrews, who knew every rivet of Titanic's design. For an uneasy moment, Smith remembered prior brushes with ice in his career. Always he had managed to steer clear. This time, fate seemed less forgiving. 11:45 p.m. The carpenter, a burly and capable man, arrived first. His face was grim as he reported water pouring into the forward compartments. Not just a trickle. He described a volume that suggested multiple breaches in the plating. Smith felt an internal jolt of alarm, but forced himself to remain outwardly calm. Leadership, he had learned, often meant absorbing panic so others did not. Shortly after, Thomas Andrews, still half-dressed from being roused out of bed, strode onto the bridge. His eyes flicked to Smith's, and the captain read the alarm there. Andrews had hurried down to the ship's mail hold and forward compartments. He had glimpsed enough to conclude that at least 5 watertight compartments were compromised. Titanic, Andrews reminded him, could remain afloat with 4 flooded, but 5 was beyond the ship's design limits. Smith listened with a sinking feeling in his chest. He was a man who trusted logic and knowledge. Andrews had both in spades. There is no saving her then, the captain thought, though he did not voice those words. Yet that truth clung like a cold weight in his mind. Titanic was mortally wounded. 11:50 p.m, still on the bridge, Smith took a measured breath, steeling himself for the greatest crisis he had ever faced at sea. He gave the order for the Marconi operators to transmit CQD, the Universal Distress Call. They would use the newer SOS signal as well, in hopes that modern ships might listen for it. A faint, surreal sense enveloped him. Titanic, queen of the seas, sending out a cry for help. He summoned his senior officers, Chief Officer Wild, First Officer Murdoch, and Second Officer Charles Lightoller. As they gathered, Smith explained Andrews's findings, quietly but firmly. The ship might stay afloat for an hour, maybe 2, but no longer. He watched their faces register shock, then resolve. Each man had spent a career on ships, but no one on board had witnessed a calamity quite like this. Yet Smith could not display fear. A lifetime at sea had taught him that in chaos a captain's composure could sustain the crew. He dispatched the carpenter to continue inspecting compartments below, if only to confirm the worst. In the back of his mind, he clung to a slender hope that the pumps might gain time. But deep down he knew how swiftly water overcomes steel once the ocean finds its way inside. By midnight, Titanic still floated seemingly upright, most passengers unaware of the mortal wound below. Smith's first step was to instruct the stewards to begin rousing everyone. Ask them to put on lifebelts, he ordered, and bring them on deck. The stewards, perplexed but obedient, hurried off to knock on doors. Smith imagined the scenario unfolding. Well-dressed passengers, half asleep, opening cabin doors to baffling orders. At the same time, the crew uncovered and prepared the lifeboats. Smith felt a pang of dismay at their number. Titanic carried more lifeboats than legally required. But he had known from the start that they wouldn't accommodate everyone. The maritime regulations had not caught up with such a massive liner. He had never truly thought they would be needed for a mass evacuation. Who could imagine Titanic sinking? Trying not to dwell on that, Smith left the bridge to walk along the decks. At times, his thoughts drifted to his family back home, particularly his beloved daughter. He had hoped to retire soon after Titanic's maiden voyage. Now he would face a duty no captain wanted, choosing who might live and who might die. 10 minutes past midnight, the ship's officers and the handful of passengers already on deck were beginning to sense a subtle list forward, but it was not extreme enough to sow widespread alarm. Many believed Titanic, being so grand, could not possibly sink so quickly. In truth, Titanic's compartments were filling at a rate that guaranteed eventual doom, though the deck remained calm enough that some scoffed at the idea of leaving the warm salons for a lifeboat on a freezing Atlantic. Smith returned to the bridge. He glanced at the ocean beyond Titanic's bows, black, cold, infinite. He pictured the watery labyrinth below, 5 great compartments flooding relentlessly. Thomas Andrews appeared at his elbow, quietly confirming that the pumps could not keep pace. They had an hour or two at best. Spurred by Andrews's words, Smith ordered women and children first. This was tradition, but also a moral code dear to him, and yet a knot twisted in his chest. He knew from the lifeboat capacity alone that many men, and quite a few women, would not see dawn. Still, he had to maintain order to prioritise those whom society deemed most vulnerable. In silent anguish, he vowed to do everything possible for everyone else as well. By 12:20, the first lifeboats were ready at the davits. A handful of women, startled from their warm first-class cabins, stood uncertainly near the rails. Some clung to fur coats or dressing gowns, others in fancy evening wear. The hush was uncanny. There was no mass panic yet. Instead, an odd reluctance pervaded the crowd. A few men quietly guided their wives into the boats, but more than a few women balked at stepping into a small craft dangling over a dark void. Smith walked to one of the starboard stations where Murdoch oversaw the loading. The captain noticed at once that fewer than half the seats in the lifeboat were being filled. "They fear the ropes will snap if the boat is full," Murdoch said in a subdued tone, "and some passengers aren't convinced we need to leave at all." Smith gave a brisk nod. He understood the concern. No officer wanted to risk a boat overloaded, nor did they want to incite panic by forcing people on board. Women and children were guided in gently, and some seats remained empty, despite Andrews's dire warnings echoing in Smith's mind. As the first boat descended, ropes squeaking, the Atlantic swallowed it in darkness below. Smith lingered by the railing, a swirl of thoughts passing through him, the desire to reassure everyone, the knowledge that each empty seat might doom someone later, and the tension between wanting calm and wanting urgency. But any show of force or panic might lead to a stampede, and he dreaded that possibility even more. By midnight, word had begun to spread below decks that something was indeed wrong. Passengers from second and third class started filtering onto the boat deck. Smith noticed their fearful eyes darting around, searching for leadership and answers. He did his best to maintain a reassuring expression. The band began to play light music, something sprightly, though the tune was lost in the cold wind. While crossing from starboard to port, Smith paused near the Marconi cabin. Inside, Harold Bride and Jack Phillips tapped out distress messages with frantic intensity. Sparks of hope flickered when they mentioned contact with RMS Carpathia. She was responding, but her distance meant it would be hours before she arrived. Smith closed his eyes, letting the knowledge settle. Hours. Too many precious hours. He moved on, crossing paths with Thomas Andrews again. The ship's builder looked stricken, muttering about the rising water in the mailroom and cargo holds. He kept repeating that this fate was sealed the moment the 5th compartment flooded. Smith placed a reassuring hand on Andrews's shoulder. They both understood the ship's structural reality far too well. Flares began to arc into the night sky at 1:45. Smith authorised them in hopes of drawing a closer ship's attention, though he knew of none nearer than Carpathia. Each brilliant white burst cast ghostly light across the decks, illuminating the lifeboats as they swung out. The deck now had a discernible tilt forward, though many areas were still relatively level. Passengers clustered in small knots, some murmuring that the collision couldn't be that serious. Others began to sense an undercurrent of dread in the officers' voices. Some boats on the starboard side dropped, with 30 or 40 souls, well below their capacity. Smith's chest constricted every time he watched a boat drift into the darkness, seats unfilled. Yet he recognised the complexities. Women and children first meant men were typically turned away, unless no woman or child appeared, and some women refused to go without their husbands, or with strangers, especially when the deck did not yet appear wildly perilous. Smith glimpsed Chief Officer Wild, stoic, ushering a trembling woman to a lifeboat. He saw Lightoller on the port side, barking commands, eyes flicking for any sign of trouble. Good men, all of them. Inside his own mind, Smith wrestled with second-guessing. Should he have insisted on filling the boats to capacity right from the start? Should he have hammered home the ship's imminent doom? But to do so risked mayhem that could ruin any orderly evacuation. At times he flashed back to quieter nights at sea on lesser ships, where an air of quiet confidence had been enough to keep passengers calm. Tonight demanded more, yet the old instinct still reigned. By the time the clock struck 1, the forward tilt had become undeniable. Passengers noticed it, the deck subtly slanting underfoot. Now more people sensed the truth. Titanic was in real trouble. Smith, moving between lifeboat stations, saw panic creeping into faces. The hush that had reigned began to crack. A few shouts rang out, anxiety swelled. Still, the band played, though the tunes turned to softer melodies, each note drifting across the frigid air like a final lullaby. Smith took a moment near the grand staircase, imagining how this majestic heart of the ship would soon lie silent on the ocean floor. Memories of earlier dinners and receptions flitted through his mind. The wealth, the finery, all about to vanish beneath black waters. Some of the crew approached him, uncertain whether to bar men from the boats if no more women were immediately present. Smith reaffirmed, women and children first, but if women were not forthcoming, the officers could allow men to board, ensuring the seats did not go vacant. He felt the moral weight. It could not be women and children only, for that would doom empty seats. Yet confusion reigned on the boat deck. In some cases, an officer enforced a stricter interpretation, in others, a looser one. Smith did his best to communicate clearly, but in the rush, not every directive found its mark. Around 1:15, grim news arrived from below. Water had overwhelmed the mail hold, swallowing thousands of letters and parcels. One by one, the watertight compartments were succumbing. The engineers and firemen worked valiantly in the boiler rooms, keeping pumps running, but they fought a losing battle. The captain felt a surge of pride and sorrow for the men toiling below, many of whom would never leave their posts. Thomas Andrews cornered Smith again, looking pale. He quietly explained that the sinking might happen even faster than predicted. The structural integrity near the bow was weakening by the minute. Smith's voice stayed calm, but inside he felt his heart pound. He told Andrews to keep assisting with the evacuation, to guide passengers to the boats. Andrews nodded, slipping away with the air of a man facing the inevitable. Smith popped his head into the Marconi cabin once more. Jack Phillips and Harold Bride looked exhausted, still tapping out signals. They had reached Carpathia, the Mount Temple, and others, but no one was close enough to prevent tragedy. Their signals were growing more desperate. Smith, with quiet sympathy, told them to keep at it a while longer, though in his core he doubted rescue ships would arrive in time. Around 1:30, the scene on deck grew more frantic. The list had sharpened. Water was creeping onto the forward well deck, and those below could feel the ominous presence of the ocean. Smith stepped around frightened clusters of passengers, gently directing them to the nearest lifeboats. Some still wore evening finery, ladies with jewels glinting in the rocket light, men in dinner jackets. Others had donned bulky lifebelts over coats and scarves, lending them a surreal, bulky silhouette. Smith's mind leapt to his family in Hanley, to the retirement he had planned after Titanic's maiden voyage. He had envisioned peaceful days ashore, free from the endless rolling of the sea. Now, fate had chosen him to helm this ill-starred crossing. The sorrow pressed on him, yet as captain he could not relent in trying to save lives. He walked by a collapsible boat station where crewmen struggled to unfasten the final lifeboats from their storage positions. Shouts rose. The angle of the deck made the operation more difficult. The captain offered quiet encouragement, gripping a railing to keep his balance. He noticed Second Officer Lightoller, his face etched with concern, directing a group of women forward. At Smith's nod, Lightoller continued the boarding, though now the entire boat deck felt tense, brimming with desperation. By 1:45, the bow was well down, and people who had lingered inside the warmth of the ship now rushed topside, alarmed at the unstoppable flooding. The stewards had done their best to rouse everyone, but confusion reigned. Some men tried to slip into the boats, prompting terse showdowns with officers brandishing sidearms to maintain order. Women and children first was shouted again and again, echoing above the moan of the wind. Smith hovered near the starboard side, scanning the gloom for any sign of rescue lights. There was nothing but star-flecked darkness. Distress rockets still burst overhead at intervals, a silent plea to the emptiness. He could not help recalling rumours from earlier in the night. There might have been a ship not too far off, but no response had come aside from Carpathia, still hours away. He looked at each lifeboat as it was lowered away. In some, he saw tears on the faces of women parted from husbands or fathers. In others, he saw children huddled beneath blankets. He caught a glimpse of one father quietly pressing a toy into his small son's hands before the boat descended. The moment tore at Smith's heart. He looked down, fists clenching in helpless frustration. There was no reversing this tragedy. By 2, nearly all the wooden lifeboats had gone, and only the collapsibles remained. Captain Smith realised there would be no more organised departures once those were launched. Whatever happened next would be chaos as Titanic's angle steepened. The stern was beginning to lift from the water, revealing the ship's massive propellers. The deck underfoot felt precarious, sloping toward the sea. Smith issued his final official instructions to those around him. He released the wireless operators from their duties, thanking them softly for their devotion. They had done all they could, tapping out desperate signals into the void. He told any remaining crew, "Save as many as you can." A few tried to urge him to follow them to safety, but he could not. As master of Titanic, tradition and personal honour demanded he share the fate of his ship. Yet the personal side of Smith was not as stoic inside. His thoughts flew to his loved ones, to the White Star Line that had entrusted him with this brand new wonder of the seas, and to the possibility that if only the ice warnings had been heeded more cautiously, or if he had insisted on different protocol, but regrets could not change the outcome now. Several men wrestled with collapsible B on the starboard side, trying to attach ropes for lowering. The deck's angle was so steep that the boat fell over, landing upside down. Captain Smith helped steady a few trembling passengers, guiding them along the railing toward what might be the final chance. Panicked voices rose. The ocean, swirling at the bow, clawed at the deck timbers. Over the cacophony, Smith heard the band still playing, though more faintly now. He silently thanked them for giving some measure of solace. He could see the lights from the forward part of the ship flicker now as water reached the power generators. Distorted reflections danced on the black water. Even at this late hour, some passengers still roamed the decks in a daze, refusing to believe Titanic would vanish beneath them. Once, Smith had believed it too, trusting in her towering bulk and watertight design. But nature's might had proven unstoppable. By 2:15, water flooded across the boat deck, swirling around the forward funnels. Screams reverberated through the night as passengers who had ventured too far forward found themselves trapped by rising water. The stern, high in the sky, dripped with funnel runoff, a grotesque angle that looked impossible for a ship once so stately. Captain Smith stood near the starboard bridge wing. Icy spray stung his face, but he hardly felt it. The Titanic's forward superstructure was all but submerged. He peered out one last time, hoping against hope to see Carpathia or another vessel's lights. Only darkness stared back. He remembered earlier nights at sea, guiding ships under star-filled skies, feeling the wind and salt air that had been his companions for decades. This was an ending he could never have envisioned for his career. Yet here he was, minutes from Titanic's final breath. Regret pressed on him, but so did an odd clarity. He had fulfilled his duty as best he could under the circumstances, fighting for order over panic, trying to salvage lives even in an impossible situation. The electric lights that had glowed so brilliantly aboard Titanic began to flicker. In a heartbeat, everything went dark, plunging the decks into chaos. The stern rose almost vertical, the massive hull groaning like a wounded beast. People scrambled, grasping at railings. Some leapt into the sea in desperation. A wrenching sound echoed across the water as the ship's internal structures tore under stress. Smith gripped a stanchion to keep his balance. For a suspended moment, he felt timeless, as if the world itself had paused before final destruction. His mind filled with impressions of the night, the gentle illusions at dinner, the collision's vibration, Thomas Andrews's grave expression, the underfilled boats bobbing away. He closed his eyes, resigned. A wave of guilt mixed with sorrow. So many lifeboat seats gone unoccupied in the early minutes when calm had reigned. But there was no undoing it now. The final plunge came in a rush. Titanic's stern soared, then slid beneath the ocean, pulling vast amounts of water and debris in its wake. Captain Smith was swept from his post by a torrent of freezing Atlantic. The shock of the icy brine stole his breath, the raw cold a stark punctuation to a lifetime of sailing. Waves churned violently. Amid the floating deck chairs, broken timbers and the swirl of despair, he caught fleeting glimpses of others in the water, their eyes wide with terror. What happened to him next lay beyond mortal knowledge. Only that he vanished into the frigid dark. Whether he drowned quickly, or succumbed to hypothermia, or struck wreckage, no one could say. In that last conscious moment, he might have felt sorrow, acceptance, or an overwhelming sense of his duty fulfilled. The roar of ocean claimed him as it claimed the mighty Titanic. And so, at around 2:20 a.m., Titanic slipped beneath the Atlantic, taking Captain Edward J. Smith with her. In the hours that followed, only a fraction of those aboard were pulled to safety. Later, survivors would speak of the captain's calm, of his final orders, of the line he towed between preserving order and urging haste. Some would criticize him for not packing the first lifeboats. Others would honor him for upholding tradition and discipline under unimaginable duress. Those last hours revealed not only the ship's fatal design flaw, but also the immense strain placed upon a single individual. For Edward J. Smith, the illusions of grandeur and invincibility were torn away, leaving him with the solemn truth that no vessel, however splendid, can defy nature's might forever. His legacy, like that of Titanic, remains interwoven with bravery, tragedy, and the inexorable laws of the sea.